Members, we now turn to the Environmental Reporting Bill, and the question is that Part 1 stand part. This is debate on clauses 3 to 5.
Mr Chairman.
I call Dr Megan Woods.
Mr Chairman, I'm happy to take a call on this committee stage of the Environmental Reporting Bill. And specifically, Mr Chairman, I want to talk to Clause 3, the purpose of this bill. Because I think within Clause 3 of this bill, the purpose statement and what we would expect of this bill and what we will find through further contributions on this piece of legislation, Mr Chairman, we'll see why it is that Labor is unable to support this legislation. And it's not with any great happiness that we come into this House unable to support this legislation, Mr Chairman. That if we look at the broad purpose of the fact that New Zealand is one of the only countries in the OECD not to have a robust environmental reporting system, if we look at the broad purpose that we would have an independent check and balance on the state of our environment, Mr Chairman, these are all worthy aims and something that we could support. But unfortunately, Mr Speaker, Mr Chairman, what we do not see in the detail of the legislation that we have before us is a piece of legislation that fulfils those lofty and worthy goals that we would be happy to support. And Mr Speaker, the purpose statement, the purpose clause of this bill was actually the subject of a reasonable amount of activity for the submitters to this bill. 11 submissions were received on this clause of the bill from the submissions that were heard at the Select Committee stage. And most of the submitters did recommend some tidying up of the drafting that was in here. That in particular, the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment gave a very good submission that proposed a much cleaner Clause 3 of this legislation than one that was in the early drafts that went to committee, Mr Chairman. And the suggestion of the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was that there just be a very simple purpose statement put in here around what it is that the bill purports to do. And the purpose of this Act is to require regular reports on the state of New Zealand's environment. And this was supported by a number of agencies, Mr Chairman. Not only did the Parliamentary Commissioner support this, but so did the Royal Forest and Bird Protection Society, Business New Zealand, the Environment Defence Society, the Resource Management Law Association and Fish and Game New Zealand. And indeed, Sir Geoffrey Palmer in Fish and Game's submission wrote a very good opinion on why it was that was to be the case. But Mr Chairman, in what needed to be done to Clause 3 is really much of what is problematic throughout the rest of this legislation. That it was muddled, it didn't really do what it needed to do, and it wasn't in a logical way to achieve it. And Mr Chairman, that is a problem that we will be referring to throughout our contributions at this committee stage of what the problems with this legislation are. Now, Mr Chairman, we did make some changes at committee, that we did remove a very cumbersome purpose statement which was there in Clause 3 and replace it with a much shorter, more elegant purpose statement which now reads, the purpose of this Act is to require regular reports on New Zealand's environment. Now, this was good that we managed to tidy this up, Mr Chairman, but it wasn't actually what was asked for from the submitters, who'd given very thoughtful submissions on the very purpose of this legislation, and there is a critical piece missing from that purpose statement. And it's for that reason that we will be supporting the Green Party's supplementary order paper, which seeks to include the state of, because it's not just about the environment, Mr Speaker. It's really important that this is about the state of our environment that we are reporting on when we report on it. And it's really important that we capture that in the purpose statement, that we have a very short, a very elegant and a very well crafted purpose purpose statement potentially that we can put there that gets to the nub of what this legislation purports to do, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, some other changes were made in this part one of the legislation at the Select Committee stage. And Mr Chairman, these were changes that we were happy to support and that were unanimous changes for the committee. One of these was recommendation of inserting of a Treaty of Waitangi clause at clause 4A. And the insertion of this clause, Mr Chairman, the insertion of this clause was to make this legislation consistent with other legislation and recognise the principles of the treaty. Because, Mr Chairman, the principles of the treaty are really important when we're considering environmental reporting and reporting on the state of the New Zealand environment. So we were more than happy to support those changes and that work that had been done. Mr Chairman, it is a real opportunity that we are missing here with this. And I think that these changes that we want to see to part one and the inconsistencies that we're going to see throughout the legislation, because what we wanted when we first started talking about environmental reporting was independent environmental reporting, and that is not what we are getting through this legislation, Mr Chairman. What we are getting is a piece of legislation where the Minister ultimately has control. And Mr Chairman, that is a problem no matter who sits on the government benches for us. It is a problem when there isn't an independence attached to this kind of reporting. It's not a slur on any particular minister. What it is to say that we genuinely want independent reporting on the state of our environment in New Zealand. And Mr Chairman, we have the opportunity to do this with this legislation, and there are some changes that could be made through supplementary order papers which are on the table, Mr Chairman, which if agreed to would mean that Labour could support this legislation, because fundamentally it is a good idea. But the execution that we are seeing in the bill that we have before us in the House tonight does not fulfil the purpose that we are talking about in clause 3 of this legislation, Mr Chairman. This is a sign that this is a government that really is lost its way, and it's failing to fulfil those objectives that it set out to do. It simply doesn't do it. It is not a piece of legislation that is fit for purpose. If our aim is to have independent environmental reporting in this country, it is not going to do that. It shows how far out of touch the government has got on what it needs to be doing. It shows that it's absolutely failing in this task. And Mr Chairman, it shows that it is a government that has reached the peak of arrogance, when it won't even listen to sensible suggestions from some very well-crafted and thoughtful submissions from some very, very good thinkers that came before Select Committee and asked that we did have genuine independence in our environmental reporting legislation. But Mr Chairman, those pleas, really, and they were pleas from many of the submitters, fell on a stony silence from the opposition members. They weren't willing to think about ways in which we could improve this legislation. And Mr Chairman, it is an opportunity lost. We could have done it. Sorry, you're quite right. Thank you, Ms Moroney. It was the government members. The opposition members were more than willing to listen to the voices of reason and to listen to very well-made cases and very thoughtful submissions, as we always are when they come before committee. Unfortunately, you're quite right, Ms Moroney, it was the government members who were not willing to listen to those submissions. So, Mr Chairman, this is the purpose when we think about the very purpose of the bill, and as we go through the stages and go through this bill clause by clause, it is absolutely imperative that we keep that purpose firmly in our minds. What it is that this legislation should be doing, and what it is when we examine other clauses of this legislation, such as clause 18, that we'll see that this legislation does not do, that it simply fails in that task. So, Mr Chairman, I look forward to further contributions on this piece of legislation, but what we have to do is consider very carefully this purpose statement of the legislation so that we can consider the other clauses as we go through and consider it. Thank you, Mr Chairman.